All right, hello again. I am Mr. Kelly here, Bill Kelly, Mr. Kelly to some, and looking forward to talking to you a little bit more about environmental science. Got a new setting for my video. I'm outdoors today, and I'm wearing my Nature Conservancy hat, as you can see. There's such an awareness now of environmental issues, and you know that because you're very much aware of them. And this is a relatively new thing for human beings to be aware of the environmental issues. I remember I've watched the movement grow. I was born in 1964, and in the 70s there was a push toward environmental awareness. It always had been there, but it became a pretty big thing in the 1970s. And so I've seen the progression of it. And right now, I think we know that this is sort of a vital interest to everybody. The era of unintended consequences is over. We now know that these amazing things that we are able to do at human beings do come at a cost, or can come at a cost. And we're more aware of these things now than we once were. But yes, in fact, last year I thought it was very interesting. There was a student who was a senior and said that they had gone back to talk to the grade school kids. And they were amazed at how much more the grade school kids knew about environmental issues. They went to talk about environmental issues, but how much more aware they were of when this student was in grade school. And this was a pretty sharp student. And I've often had the same kind of thing, that my students are so much more aware of environmental issues than people were in my time period. Again, I was born in 1964. It's 2022, so enough rambling right now. I don't know what year you're watching this, but I'm rambling on here a little bit. But to the topic, I hope, anyway. All right, so now we're into chapter 3, and that's all about ecosystems. So be prepared to learn all about ecosystems. What are they and how do they work? But before we get into the details of ecosystems, we'll have a core case study that talks about a particular ecosystem, and this is the tropical rainforest. So the tropical rainforests are located near the equators, and you can picture them. And they're just vital because they have so much biodiversity. Remember that biodiversity is one of the big principles here for sustainability. And although it's only 2% of the Earth's surface, it has about 1/2 of the known species. So the problem is we are disrupting the tropical rainforests by deforesting them. And that's been a big problem, cutting down on the biodiversity. There are species that are endemic, and they're only in these small areas in the tropical rainforest, and we clear them out and we'll never see them again. So there are major things. Besides this, we all know about the idea of how the trees take in carbon dioxide and give off oxygen, so they're the lungs of the earth. And so you're cutting down on some of that environmental benefit. And also they affect the climate, the local weather, and they can affect the climate in the fact that they are also what's called a carbon sink, where they store a lot of CO2 in all the plant life that's there. But we're clearing it out, and we no longer get those benefits when we do that. All right, so there you see they're located near the Earth's equator, and there are major harmful effects of disrupting them. All right, so that's the start there, and I think we're going to end up getting a picture here, right? So this is rainforest from 1975 when I was 11 years old, and the same area in 2003. And you can go on now, and they have these time-lapse satellite photographs and images of all over the globe. And the expansion of humans has just been incredible, where we've taken over the land and settled into it, and the population has grown, and lots of things that we'll talk a lot more about as the class goes on. All right, so how does the Earth's life support system work? It's good to kind of know how these things are working for us, right? Well, let's talk about the parts of it. first of all. And one of them would be the atmosphere, the air that we breathe. Let's talk about the troposphere. The troposphere is the layer of air, let's say, that is, or the gases that are right above the Earth's surface. That's the troposphere. But the atmosphere is the closest to the surface of the Earth. It's the innermost layer of that troposphere. And that's all the air that we breathe is in this atmosphere. So that's important. The stratosphere comes after the troposphere, and that's where the ozone layer is, which is important as well. So the stratosphere is out there as well. But that's above, and the atmosphere is supporting us. Well, if you're like me, you like to breathe. So the air that we breathe is in the atmosphere. So how does the Earth's life support system work? You get to breathe. That's a good one. All right, so then we have the hydrosphere. We can't live on air alone. We need water. The Earth's surface is 3/4 water, roughly, 70% about, I guess. And the same is true for the human body, right? We're so much water. So we should be concerned with water supporting us. So this is all of the ice and the water and the vapor that we see, the gaseous forms of it, and the mist and all those kind of things is the water that we're involved in. And the oceans have 97% of the planet's water. But if you're like me, you like to breathe air, as we've already established, and you like to drink liquids as well. So water is a big deal for us. Water is a big deal for us. All right, the next thing is the geosphere, and that's going to be the upper portion of the Earth. And this is the crust of the Earth, we'd have to say. And this is where all the nutrients are. This is where they live. This is where they grow. This is where all the organisms reproduce in there. And this is the upper level of the Earth's surface. So that's the geosphere. And the upper portion of the crust is what we're talking about. And the biosphere is all of this stuff where life is found. Bio is life, the prefix there for life. And biosphere is where all the living things are. So it's the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, and the geosphere. Here's a picture to let you know about what's going on there, and also gives you a little bit more about what's going on inside of the Earth, right past the crust. And that's important as well. And there you got the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, and how they all play out together. All right, so there are 3 things that we are going to be dependent on to sustain life. And one of them is, and we mentioned it before and we'll mention it again, is the sun. Got to have the sun. Keeps us warm, and it also supports the plant growth, gets the producers ready. We'll talk more about the producers. But it gets those plants through the magic of photosynthesis, a point where we can be fed. And we'll talk a lot more about that in this chapter and as the year goes on. It's important to have that energy. And another thing is, all right, so the one-way flow of the high-quality energy from the sun, that's the first one. And another one is the cycling of nutrients through parts of the biosphere. So we need these nutrients coming through there. And they need the plants need them to grow. We need them to survive, and the cycling is there. So that's important for the Earth's surface there. And gravity. Gravity is going to be important. Without it, we don't keep our air. We don't keep our atmosphere. So it does that for us. And it also helps with the cycling of these chemicals through the air, again, bringing things down through gravity. The water, we have the water that's coming down hills that's, runs from the mountains to the rivers to the sea. So we're relying on that gravity to move the water that also moves nutrients around for us. Gravity moves it into the soil. We need that movement through the soil as well. And that's the deal there with gravity. So gravity is important. I mentioned it in the last video. It's a law. It's past a theory. It's a law, the law of gravity. All right, but these are the 3 things that we need, and of course you should be aware of them. Here's a nice visual to give you an idea of what's going on. There's that solar energy. So some of it is absorbed by the Earth's surface. Some of it's reflected back out to the atmosphere, back out to space. And the stuff that is absorbed there is converted to heat, and then that warms our atmosphere for us. And then another thing when we're talking about the atmosphere is the idea that some of this heat doesn't escape. These are the greenhouse gases. And it's this business here that warms up our surfaces, that we don't lose all of that stuff. So the heat, some of the heat remains. So we talk about greenhouse gases and the greenhouse effect. And the greenhouse gas is a good thing. And greenhouse greenhouse gases, making the greenhouse effect is a good thing. What we'll talk about later is where it can be maybe too much of a good thing because of things that humans have done. But the greenhouse gases in themselves are pretty important. So, what are the major components of an ecosystem? So, we already talked about the biosphere, and in there's going to be, the ecosystems that we're going to start talking about. And these contain communities where there's different species living together, populations of a single species, and organisms that act on their own or are part of a population or a part of the community. We're going to be talking about the feeding levels, the trophic levels that are going on, and we're going to be talking about the producers, the autotrophs. Now, this equation that's on the board is the magic equation where the producers, the plants, go through photosynthesis. So here you go, carbon dioxide and water, and you got to have sunlight, and that's going to produce glucose, a sugar for you that gives us all our energy, and also a nice benefit. First of all, we get the energy from this, and then it gives us off the oxygen as well. So we get to breathe and we get to eat because of this magic trick. So I'm a big fan of it. All right, so the feeding levels are called trophic levels. So this is the different feeding levels, and the producers started out. So the producers are the first level, and then we have the consumers that are in there as well. So the producers are the autotrophs that I mentioned already. Go through this magic equation for you. They start off the trophic levels, where you've got the producers first, and after that you've got the consumers, and they are able to not produce their own energy. They have to get it. So the consumers, and there's different types of consumers that we could talk about here, and that's what we're doing right now. So this is the consumers, and when you talk about the consumers, you're going to talk about herbivores. Those are the primary consumers all of the time. The primary consumers are herbivores, and that means they only eat plants. And then there are carnivores who eat meat. And so this is going to be maybe a secondary consumer. They have to eat the primary consumers in order to get their energy. They can't get it from the plants. So they have to eat like a deer, let's say, a deer. And ideally, we get rid of a lot of the carnivores, but a deer would be a primary consumer, and is one that we're very familiar with around here. And then a secondary consumer would be like the carnivores that eat on it. Maybe a wolf, but we got rid of all the wolves around here, right? But that would be secondary, and sometimes there's a tertiary, so we could talk about these food chains and going up these trophic levels, starting with the producers, then the primary consumers, then the secondary and tertiary or beyond. Omnivores are species that can eat both plants and meat, so they have the options of those. Humans are omnivores. Bears, I guess, would be a good one. There we go. All right. So here's a breakdown for you, giving things a little bit of review. And anytime you see these things in the book, they're pretty valuable diagrams for you there. But this one here talks about the different levels, building up from atoms, as we did in the last chapter, to molecules. And after molecules, we've got the cells that are made up of these molecules, and then an organism, an individual. And then a population is a bunch of them. And a community is the interaction of a bunch of these different species. And then the ecosystem is where they live and where they're interacting with each other, and also the non-living parts of it. There's your ecosystem. And we'll build up to the biosphere that we talked about before, which is where all the life is in the biosphere. All right, so let's get to it, talking more about these ecosystems. And here you got an idea of an ecosystem that really kind of talks about some of these things for you and some new concepts. So there's your producer. There is a primary consumer, in this case a rabbit that eats the producer. There's a fox, and those are kind of nice consumers, nice predators to have around, and keeping things in balance. and then you are talking about this nutrient cycling. So something dies, it decomposes into the ground, these nutrients go back into the plants with a little bit of water, and you've got a cycle there. The precipitation comes down, the carbon dioxide comes in, and you can see it's giving off oxygen. So here's a nice summation of the basic ways that ecosystem works. And after all, that is our topic, isn't it? All right, so here is a graphic example for you of a predator eating a primary consumer, an herbivore. So that's a lion with a zebra. So this is part of the deal there. All right, so we haven't really talked about decomposers yet, but decomposers break down the dead stuff. They break down the dead stuff so the nutrient cycling can continue. Everybody's got their part in these ecosystems. And one that we're very familiar with and we see often around here are vultures, and they will break down dead stuff. They'll take dead stuff and they'll eat them, and through their waste, the nutrients will get back into the ecosystem. But those are visible ones to us. There's a lot of stuff's going on at the microscopic level. So you can see a dead tree and you see, well, the tree is dead. That's the end of the story. No, it's not. Dead trees have lots of value. And they are broken down by little insects. These are the detritus feeders. And then the decomposers that I guess you'd be talking about here are the fungus and the stuff like that. I should have said probably that the vultures are detritus feeders, I guess, more to the point. I mean, they feed on this stuff. The decomposers break it down by biological methods. But there you go. Hey, by the way, while I'm talking to vultures, you know what? If you want to have a secret that you want to keep, you could tell it to a vulture, and if they don't know sign language or how to write, they'll never give up your secret. Because here's something you may not know. I thought it was interesting. For the longest time, I didn't know it, but when I found it out, I thought it was interesting. Those vultures, you'll never hear a peep out of them. They don't have voice boxes. So that's pretty interesting. To me, anyway. All this stuff is interesting to me, right? You decide. All right, so here's another idea of how this is cycled through the trophic levels. And there's some significance to this thing here, and that's talking about heat being given off. So the sun comes down, and all of that energy goes on the plants, lands on the plants. But before the consumers can get to it, the respiration goes on. Plants go through respiration as we do as well. And they give off heat. Just in living, they give off heat. And the consumers do. So before it gets to the decomposers, or before it gets to the next level up the food chain, there's going to be heat given off at every step along the way. So we'll talk more about the significance of that, and it is very significant. But we'll get to that in a little bit. We'll talk about soil here. Got to have the soil. Soil is a renewable resource, but it takes a while. So soil maintenance is an important thing that human beings haven't done such a great part of, a great job of in the past. And I think like a lot of things, unintended consequences. We thought all this stuff was infinite. It was going to go on forever. Not true the way we've done it. But soil is a mixture of rock and particles and minerals and organic matter and water absorbed in it and gases that are dissolved in it and air and living organisms. There's a lot going on in the soil. Some people look at it and they call it dirt. But, well, as my wife, who I'll mention in this class, says, there's no such thing as dirt. It's soil. But my wife, as I'll mention many times in class, is also involved in environmental science. She's actually a PhD, so she's really knowledgeable and a great resource for me. But I like that saying of hers. There's no such thing as dirt. She gets a little. She always points that out if people say dirt. It's soil, and there's a lot going on in it. Dirt degrades it. I don't know. It's fun. But anyway, and also I want to go on record as saying that I will say many times, she is the brains of the operation. So as much as I know, boy, she's really knowledgeable and a great resource for me, and you'll benefit from it as well, because she's always passing things on to me that I pass on to my students. Okay, so let's talk about this energy in the ecosystem. Energy is going to flow through these trophic levels. So in one way that it does, the simplest way of breaking it down is in a food chain. So the energy goes from one level to another. I mean, first we've got that perpetual resource of the sun that is always there, right? And then it outputs the plants. So the plants begin the food chain, and then that energy goes up the trophic levels, and the nutrients go along with it, right? And then it happens every time you go up the trophic scale. So that's a food chain. And a food chain would just be one link. It would go like straight across. And a food web would be lots of interconnecting stuff. We know, like in a food chain, and I'll show you a graphic of it, but in a food chain, oh, here it is now. In a food chain, you kind of just got the arrows going one way. Like the plants are eaten by the herbivores. There's a caterpillar that's doing that. Then the secondary consumer, the bird, eats the caterpillar. You see in every step, heat is given off. That's going to be important to talk about the quantity of energy that's available at each level. But again, this is a food chain. And I do want to point out the direction of the arrows. I intuitively thought like the caterpillar, the arrow would go from the caterpillar to the plant because it was eating it. But the food chain arrows, and we'll get used to it because that's the convention that we'll use and everybody uses, is that it shows which way the energy is going. And that's the topic here, the energy through the food chain and these trophic levels. But again, this is just simplified because we know that there's more than one thing. It's not just the caterpillars eating the plants, right? There's lots of things doing that. All right, now I was talking about this energy here, and this is an important concept. So perk your ears up with all this stuff here. Here again, you see the heat given off, and this is what's called a pyramid. So it's a trophic pyramid, I guess you could call it. And the idea is showing that how much less energy is available at each step. So the plants get 10,000 kilocalories, okay, so whatever the unit is. And that's how much they have shining down on them. But they're giving off the heat. They're going through the respiration. So the primary consumers, let's say, in this case, they're given a one, it's an aquatic one. They'd have the zooplankton, right? And the zooplankton is going to eat the phytoplankton. By the way, phytoplankton, very important. Let's talk about it right now. In the aquatic systems, phytoplankton are so small, but they also do the photosynthesis, and it's about half of the photosynthesis on the planet. So we've talked about you like breathing air, and that's because of the oxygen. You need it to live, right? So yeah, but the phytoplankton also gives off oxygen. So every other breath you take, you can thank the aquatic system because it's half of the oxygen that's available on the planet. All right, so zooplankton would eat that. They'd be a primary consumer, right? But they only have 1,000 kilocalories. And here's the idea of the trophic pyramid. And the idea is that it's a very much an estimate, but a very good estimate, that there's only 10% available at the next trophic level because 90% is lost to this heat. Remember, we talked about efficiencies a little bit in the last chapter. But this is the second law of thermodynamics. And as you're going through these energy transformations, there's no way around this one. This is not something that you can change that we know about right now anyway. This is nature's rule, not a human thing. So far. All right, so here's a food web for you, an aquatic one as well. And this shows you how there's interdependence. You know, the penguin is going to be eaten by the seal, but the penguin eats squid, and the penguin also eats fish, you know. So this is a food web showing that it's interconnections here. All right, so there you go. All right, very, very cool. Okay, and here's another one for you, and this is more a terrestrial one, but it can show you how there's a food web and some more stuff going on. This would be in an ecosystem that would seem to be in a desert location. All right, so let's talk about here things about, let's talk about quantifying things again, as we've talked about as being important in this. And some ecosystems are able to produce the plant matter faster. They've got more ability to do that. And a measurement of this is the gross primary productivity. So this is the rate at which an ecosystem's producers take that stuff and convert it into chemical energy. So how fast do they do it? And that's the gross primary productivity, the GPP. And that is usually put out in units that are going to be in energy per area of land per year. So some of them are better than others, given the same amount of time period, a year, and the same amount of land, some of these ecosystems can put out more energy, is really what it comes down to. And the net primary productivity is the rate at which an ecosystem's producers convert them into chemical energy minus the stuff that they lose. So it's the minus the 90% in general anyway. But this is, of course, different for different ecosystems as well, but that's a good general rule for you. And okay, so the net primary productivity is different for aquatic zones and terrestrial ones. And this net primary productivity, the stuff that's available to the producers, can of course be a limiting factor for the continuation of that food chain. And remember that biodiversity. You got to have all the different pieces of these food chains and these food webs, or else you're in some trouble there. So this can be a limiting factor for all living things and also for humans. So we're not immune to that stuff, although we've sort of behaved like we were at some point or another, that we weren't part of this system. But we're understanding more and more our link in that chain and how we're relying on that chain and those food webs and that biodiversity. All right, so here's a little graphic for you that gives you an idea of the different terrestrial and aquatic systems. So estuaries, that stuff that's, the area, the wetlands areas, are the best for the productivity. Swamps and marshes that are the wetland areas that are near the sea, I guess, are also that. But yeah, all right, so this gives you the idea here. And the tropical rainforests, as you would expect, are pretty good here. So this is the breakdown here for you of the net primary productivity. And you can see, again, the tropical rainforest, why it would be important for all that stuff. The open ocean doesn't have the same numbers as far as the rates, but it covers so much space that it makes it hugely important for this stuff too. All right, so what happens to energy in the food chain? We've been talking about this a little bit. This is a critical concept here, and I've already brought it up with you. But ecological efficiency is the percentage of the stuff that goes from one trophic level to the next trophic level. And as I pointed out for you, in general, it follows the 10% rule, that only 10% of the stuff is going to go. So it's 10% efficient, you'd say. But that's the game, and we have to play it. So lots of it is lost to, as I said, the waste, the heat that's given off, and the respiration and all that stuff. And as I talked about in the chapter 2, that heat is not as high quality energy anymore. It can't create or destroy energy, but it goes from higher quality to lower quality. And yeah, there's some energy in the detritus and the waste that provides energy for the decomposers and the detritivores. So that's the deal there. All right, so the nutrient cycle. That's the cycles that are going throughout the ecosystem. Comes in with the solar energy, gravity, and the nutrient cycles, as we mentioned, are very important. And this matter, that's what we're talking about now, what happens to matter in the ecosystem. So we need these elements to be cycled through in these compounds. And these cycles are important. And the cycles that we would talk about are 4 of them. It's the water cycle, the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, and the phosphorus cycle. So those are the 4 cycles that you should be familiar with, and we're going to go through each one of them step by step right now. So the first one is the water cycle. We need that for life, the water cycle. And we got to have water for drinking, got to have water for agriculture, and all living things are going to need the water. And the plants and all that, we've already talked about it. So this cycle is great for us because it does a lot of things, an ecological service for us for sure. It is going to keep the water moving. It's going to purify the water and distribute it, to different places. Picks it up from one place, carries it to another place. That's the important stuff of that. Then the solar energy that comes in causes the water to evaporate, and that's another thing. That's what I just was mentioning. It is through evaporation, it gets back into the atmosphere, and is carried to other places, but the solar energy causes that. Also through the plants. The water's in the ground, it goes through the plants. The plants use what it can, but they don't waste. There's transpiration, and in transpiration, the water goes through the plants back into the atmosphere. Picked up by the atmosphere and taken to other places, comes back as precipitation where gravity brings us back to it. So that's the water cycle, or also technically or more correctly called the hydrologic cycle. And I mentioned about the idea of evaporation and then precipitation, right? Brings it other places, comes down in precipitation, which you need gravity to do. And that gives you surface waters and fresh waters that you can get to. And some of that goes into the ground and is stored in aquifers in the water cycle. So here is a nice gesture here, nice diagram that's showing you. Well, it's a nice gesture that this diagram was put there for you. But it's a nice diagram that shows you the water cycle. And you can talk about it, and you understand these things. So these are important to know. And here in red, they give you the impacts. I mentioned that groundwater's in aquifers, and we pump from those to use them for agriculture and for drinking water. But we're over pumping them. We're doing them in a way that's not sustainable. They recharge, but they recharge slowly, and we're doing that. And we're degrading the water with pollution and all these things that we'll talk about in detail in this class here. All right, so we talked about that experiment. There's more runoff when you clear the land. There's lots of things that come in, and with agriculture, there's runoff that we're talking about, and paving things over, and well, we'll talk about all that stuff in detail. All right, so those are the ways the human, yes, so we're withdrawing large amounts of fresh water. I got to get better at coordinating my talking with my stuff here. But yes, this is all the stuff that we talked about, so a review. Oh yeah, and this is a good thing to remind myself, the draining and filling the wetlands. Yeah, we fill in these wetlands and we do them for agriculture and we put human settlements. But the wetlands have a service to them, that biodiversity. They cut down on the storms, they reduce the flooding, and we've done that to our detriment as well. So that's the thing there. All right, so now the carbon cycle. Carbon is important. It's the building blocks of all living things. So we're built of this carbon too. And they're the building blocks for the things that are important that are living inside of us and other living things. The carbohydrates, the fats, the proteins, the DNA, and all these other organic compounds that have carbon in them. So photosynthesis is involved in that. Yeah, carbon is the basic building block for all the organic compounds. And the photosynthesis, which I mentioned before, is the magic trick that cycles the carbon through there, takes the CO2 out of the atmosphere. Well, that's going to be important, and converts it into oxygen, which is also important for us. And then that carbon is stored in the plant, and then it's cycled through there as well. And that's true. And then there's also the aerobic respiration. Plants give off CO2. We don't think about that as much, but they do. And of course, all other living things do. And some of this stuff also shows up in the ocean. I mentioned the term carbon sink, but here it shows up right in my presentation. The ocean is a huge carbon sink because it stores a lot of carbon dioxide in there. It's dissolved in the ocean, and also stored in the marine sediments. So you know that, right? Fish breathe underwater, but they're not breathing the oxygen in the H2O. They're breathing the dissolved oxygen, the gases that are dissolved inside the ocean. So the ocean has lots of gases inside of it, and carbon dioxide is one of them. All right, so here is a visual for the carbon dioxide for you. And then, this gives you an idea of what's going on in the carbon chain. So this is all familiar. We've kind of talked about it already. But this is a really nice graphic, so you should be aware of it and kind of understand it. We human beings are also disrupting the carbon cycle, right? So we are doing that by creating more CO2 than can be removed. I mean, it was a balance that was going on there. We're creating more of that CO2 that can be removed. And other greenhouse gases, like I said before, greenhouse gases are important. We need them to warm up the atmosphere. We wouldn't be able to live without it. But we have created more of these greenhouse gases, and we're trapping more of that heat, and temperatures are going up. That's for sure. All right, so we're doing it faster than can be removed, and right about my time period is when we really started amping it up. The baby boomers, right about the 60s, and we didn't really even think about it until the 70s, and then the warning signs have been going off since then, and now it's getting a little bit even more drastic. So it's changing the climate, it's warming up the atmosphere, and this is mostly recognized by most human beings by now. It was debatable in the 70s and the 80s and even into the 90s, but I don't think it's as debatable as it once was. All right, so we're disrupting it in a lot of different ways. The next cycle is the nitrogen cycle, and that's bacteria moving around, and this is important. Nitrogen. You know, nitrogen is in the atmosphere, right? It's the most prevalent gas in the atmosphere. We forget about that because we're concerned with the oxygen, or sometimes people forget about it, but it's by far the most prevalent gas in the atmosphere. So lightning and bacteria can make this nitrogen show up into the topsoil, which is where we need it, because nitrogen is one of these nutrients that's needed in order for plants to grow. It's another magic trick that nature provides for us if we'll let it. And there we go. So the plants use it to produce these proteins and the nucleic acids and vitamins, and they need it to grow. And it's a big component of fertilizer. And then the bacteria there converts these nitrogen compounds back into nitrogen gas so that this can continue. So the nitrogen cycle involves that bacteria. And a lot of this takes place in the soil, right? So that's the thing. So useful forms of nitrogen are formed, and the bacteria convert it back into the nitrogen gas, and the cycle goes on. All right, so I've already mentioned that before. Here come the things, and pause them if you need to write them down, of course. But yes, we have also altered the cycle. One thing is we're taking large amounts out of the atmosphere to create fertilizer, and that isn't the natural way of it. We're doing that because we haven't been so good with soil management. And so we have to use this stuff. The fossil fuels that we burn, yes, they give off the carbon. We talk about that a lot. But they also give off nitric oxide. And that comes back to us in acid rain. And a lot of this stuff, too, from the fertilizers gets into the water. The acidity does. But on land, also, that affects the thing. And then some of these nitrates, the excess nitrates that we're putting in as fertilizer show up in the water, and that creates problems in the aquatic systems. And we are doing more and more of this stuff, and we can expect more and more of that to happen. There's more and more people. We're not cutting down on the human population. It's still growing exponentially. And we got to feed them, and that means a lot of fertilizer. So that's a big problem. All right, so here you go. You can see it, right? And this is good too, good information for you to have. How the ammonia in the soil is, the bacteria turns it into nitrates. The nitrates are being able to be taken up, and we cut that step out, right, by putting nitrates right into our fertilizers. And then the nitrogen is in the plants, comes back, decomposition brings it back in. You got the cycle going on. And there's again the bacteria that can bring it back to the atmosphere. Denitrification, and makes it nitrogen gas again. All right, and that's how we affect it in the graphic form too. All right, phosphorus is the slowest of the cycle. It goes through water, rocks, and the food webs. It's the only one that doesn't have an airborne quantity to it for the most part. It's also, involved in phosphorus is in terms of phosphates for fertilizers. The plants need that as well. And we're affecting this by clearing off the forests and making the fertilizers. And then some of these phosphates also get into the aquatic systems. And that's a problem. Phosphorus is a slow cycle, so we have to be aware of that one. So we can go through the cycle, but if we disrupt it too much, we're in big trouble. Okay, so we need it. And yes, through the water, the Earth's crust, and the living organisms, and the human activities I've already talked about. So that's just to remind you that we know about these things. All right. And how do we study these ecosystems? So a lot of things that we do for the methods of study, one of the things that we do is field research. You go out there, and they call it muddy boots ecology, and you go out there and you really go out there and check out what's going on. You count stuff by hand, and you figure all that stuff. So you go into these natural settings. And my wife has great experience with that stuff. And through her, I've gotten a bit of experience too, but she's out there with that muddy boots ecology. She likes to go out and really, really get involved with it. And we've been involved with a lot of great projects. And through her getting her PhD, she did research down in the Everglades, where she ran from alligators and did all kinds of stuff. She's an amazing woman. And also the brains of the operation, I want to point out. But so that's muddy boots ecology, where you go out there and you get dirty and sweaty. And I kind of enjoy it myself too. It's not for all people, that's for sure. So, you know, it's hard to go out and go into every place. So a lot of the stuff you want to isolate certain things that you're looking at. So of course the scientists use laboratory experiments too. Now you can't replicate everything that's going on in nature, but you can certainly run some controlled experiments where you keep a lot of the factors constant and you change some of them. We've talked about controlled experiments before, and we'll talk about them some more. And another thing you do is mathematically looking at this stuff, right? So you take a look at the trends, the mathematical trends, and you try to extrapolate from that. And there are other things that they use to model this stuff too. They'll use computer models, and they'll start saying, well, what does the ecosystem look like? And they'll try to extrapolate. If we do this, we've noticed this in the laboratory. So what would happen if we were doing that out in nature? What could we expect the results to be? And these models are, you know, we get better and better at them. You live and you learn, but this is something that we're constantly refining. But at least we're looking at it now, which is a relatively new thing for human beings, as I mentioned before. My lifetime, anyway. I've seen the big change. In your lifetime, it's been happening. So now, think about this. I think about this stuff. When did humans first get above the earth, you know, besides being up on a cliff or climbing a mountain? Hot air balloons, not too long ago, where we got that bird's eye view. But now we have aircraft and satellites and imagery. And so this is a tool that's used more and more as these technologies are developing, where we can take pictures and pretty, you know, accurate pictures and, you know, really detailed pictures. And then we can count things rather than going out with the muddy boots. So the aircrafts are away, and the satellites, as I mentioned. GIS, the Geographical Information System. This is where we've been mapping out the Earth here, and we've got databases upon databases now of where we got this stuff. And this is a software that can help us model and see what's going on all over the planet now. It's crazy. GPS, right? We can tag animals. We want to see what's going on with them. We don't know what was going on. We can get accurate visions of where they go by attaching these things to them, these GPSs. It's crazy, and that's something, again, that has changed within my lifetime. You'll hear me wax philosophical about the good old days. I guess a lot of old people do that. You can figure out my age in 2022 because I told you I was born in 1964. But it's amazing for me to see these transformations that have happened in the way humans do things, just the technology of it. I know I start sounding like an old person. Why, when I was young, but it'll happen to you too. So I'll close this one by asking you to think about, what are the things that you're going to ramble on as an old person? You know, I remember when, you know, I don't know. Hopefully it's something good where we've turned around some of these things sustainably. But there's a lot of things to think about, and I look forward to talking to you about them and seeing you back in class the next time. Thanks for your kind attention.